I'm going to ask a question that sounds silly, but I promise it's not. How is life exists, therefore God did it, any different from life exists, therefore wizards did it?
In defense of most Christians, they don't feel the need to explicate here because the difference between a theistic being and a wizard is so intuitively obvious that nobody really feels the need to explicate here. God is a metaphysically necessary, unembodied mind who is necessarily eternal, perfectly free, omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, and the creator of all contingent things. For more on what God is, you can even look at Swinburne's work, The Coherence of Theism, the second edition. This was published in 2016. I highly recommend it if you actually don't know what God is. Now, by contrast, the Oxford Languages Dictionary defines a wizard as a man who has magical powers, especially in legends and fairy tales. Unsurprisingly, there's no academic literature on wizards, so this is already looking really bad because in virtue of the definition of wizard, a wizard's going to be finite, contingent, a spatiotemporal being. It has tons of different arbitrary limits. So this is not really looking too good for this reductio because a wizard isn't a really good candidate hypothesis, which we'll go into why. And keep in mind, if we just try to redefine wizard as the same thing as God, then we're really just talking about the same thing in virtue of the law of identity. We're just slapping different labels onto the same referent at that point. So the main point here is that it's not a silly question to ask why God. The silly question is why God versus wizards. So why should we think that the different evidential chips that we see in the data that we want to explain point to theism? The same reason we might think other immeasurable things that we believe exist in virtue of the data we're trying to explain. We have data that we want to explain and we come up with hypotheses to try to explain the data. We then try to see if the hypotheses predict the data, and then we use a combination of explanatory scope and other theoretical virtues to assess the probability of the hypothesis. Now you might ask, well, what predictions does theism make? And I would say theism predicts a lot of the stuff that we do see, embodied moral agents, moral facts, suffering, teleological facts, miracles, moral progress, progress in knowledge, and much, much more. Wizards, by contrast, don't really predict anything. We don't know anything about wizards other than the fact that they're humans that can do magic. We don't have any access to their motivations or their character or anything. Those are the only two things we know about these. We don't have epistemic access to these motivations, character, and other properties of the wizard because wizards can be so different because they're contingent. And so anything we try to do to get this wizard theory to explain anything is going to be very ad hoc, and the explanatory power would have to be extremely forced. By contrast, theism enjoys this explanatory scope accompanied by other theoretical virtues. Theoretical virtues are criteria that theories meet that raise or lower the probability of a theory being true. Some of these include something like simplicity. We are only positing one entity. Now you might say, well, I'm only positing one wizard. But at even more fundamental level, theism is still simpler than other single entity hypotheses strictly because theism lacks arbitrary limits. The wizard's limited in how much power it has, for instance, where theism isn't. And so lacking that explanation for those limits by something more fundamental external to the wizard that explains all contingent reality would just result in an incoherence. So in virtue of what simplicity really means here in terms of the principle of parsimony, theism is just much simpler. Explanatory power. Theism predicts these things with ease. As we can derive these predictions through God's nature, well, wizards already don't predict any of these things. And if we try to get them to predict the data, like I said earlier, it's only going to be ad hoc and it's going to lower the probability even further. Theism also enjoys evidential accuracy. The theory fits the empirical data in need of explanation. It also enjoys causal adequacy. The theory has the right resources to adequately explain all the data with force. It enjoys internal consistency. Theism's components are not internally contradictory. It also has internal coherence. The theory's components are coordinated into an intuitively plausible whole, and it lacks ad hoc hypotheses or theoretical components merely tacked on to solve isolated problems. And it also has universal coherence. The theory sits well with, or it's not an obvious contradiction with other warranted beliefs that we have. And there's much more that we can say here.
Why Yahweh specifically?
Well, without diving too much into it, it's because the evidence points to Yahweh being the one true God. We can also point to different disparities in other theistic models, like polytheism such, to show that they're highly improbable and in some cases even logically impossible. So putting aside the compelling case for the resurrection, which I've argued with at length, theism predicts many things that sometimes only the Christian tradition employs. These are things like the Trinity in incarnation, God suffering with humankind in his incarnation, moral progress and scientific progress led by God's people, God using humans to spread the message of humanity worldwide. So overall, we have tons of very good reasons to think that the probability of Christianity, given the data that we have, is higher than any other competing theory.
Were all the other humans and all the other time periods with all the other creation myths just wrong?
Yes.
Or maybe it's all a simulation and the world was created yesterday.
That's possible but not probable.
Or maybe Jeff Bezos is a wizard and this is one of his dreams.
Again, possible but not probable. And this only kicks the explanatory can back. So overall, this was just a really bad reductio. All of these possible alternative scenarios don't undermine the evidential case for Christianity at all. It just shows that we need to explicate more when we're talking about these things sometimes at a popular level. That's it.